For thousands of years, possibly since the beginning of civilization, human beings have upheld slave cultures. Freedom is a very new social idea. Slavery, being owned, whether by one or many slave masters, continues to be a worldwide power management problem rather than a strictly ethnic social construct. It could be argued that human beings are not yet or never will be able to handle the moral and practical responsibility implied by total freedom, and that coercive restrictions are necessary. It could also be argued that existing forms of restriction are their own self-fulfilling prophecies, creating despondent dependency, sly abuse of the system, or rebellious criminality, inflicting more social ills than they heal through hubris, ineptitude, and corruption. Throughout history, tribes and nations have fought with each other over collective cultural sovereignty. But as a notion, the idea of an individual's right to liberty was long in coming. In the 6th century BC, Akkadian Manshur Kurosh made the first recorded attempt after conquering Babylon. But the British were the first nation to actually break with this tradition in a permanent fashion. Britain banned outright ownership of people in 1807 and fought to end the slave trade on the high seas and across its colonial holdings. Once the notion took root that individual freedom represented the moral high ground, most monarchies fell or gave way to republics. However, my argument is that whether it proclaims itself right, left, or center, the state apparatus in any form is still slavery, albeit partial. Further, that the transition from slave to free societies is far from complete, and there are many attempts to roll backwards from all sides of the political spectrum. On an evolutionary scale, the transition towards free societies has occurred with violent speed. As an outcome of this process, the moral case against colonialism has been made with relative success as well. Freedom as an organizational social force is very new, and its roots are very shallow. That's why it's important to continue to define and pursue it, if freedom is really what people want. So let's proceed with the definition of terms. Slavery is when you and your body and everything you produce are owned by someone else. You must dress and speak as you are told to, work and live where and with whom you are ordered to. You have no right to refuse any circumstance or treatment. You have no legal recourse for perceived injustice. Freedom, therefore, is when you own your body and everything you acquire or any value you create through your work and or investment. Your person and property is protected by the same laws everyone else must submit to. Freedom will further mean that you have the choice to reinvest that value in your own endeavors and or in your children's future. If freedom is to be protected for everyone, its limit will be defined by the right to say and do anything that does not take the same freedoms you have away from others, including the right to disagree, criticize, insult, and ridicule. Freedom is expressed in voluntary or association with whomever the individual chooses, with the right to choose one's destiny. Freedom also entails dealing with the consequences of one's choices, for better or worse. Freedom, in this sense, is an unearned privilege, supposedly granted by the very fact of being sentient, alive, and embodied. Privileges are somewhat distinct from rights, as many rights entail responsibility, accountability, demonstrated competence, or justifiable self-defense. For example, the right of entry into private or national property, the right to vote, drive a car, build a bridge or building, manage a large enterprise, command a squadron, or kill humans and other animals. It can be argued that, because parents produce the children with their bodies and work and invest to nourish them with their resources, they have more of a legitimate claim on them. We could therefore see parenting as a quasi-legitimate form of slavery. For most of human history, parents had the right to kill their children unquestioned. Amazonian tribes in Brazil still practice infanticide. The state of New York passed recent legislation legitimizing infanticide as well. Before the 1900s in Europe, children were little more than indentured servants to their parents. Even now, with the UN Convention on Children's Rights, children under a determined age were still seen as belonging to their parents. In some countries, they're still sold into domestic servitude as slaves. Although hotly contested, infants and children are generally not considered accountable for their actions until a certain age. Until the moment when they are deemed accountable, they are not free, although they supposedly have the right to refuse abuse and are protected by the international rule of law. In many countries, however, these regulations are neither applied nor enforced. Although some might disagree, statistics on later success and well-being indicate that parents are best situated to care and guide their children, not the state. We could also see state-imposed rules on parenting as a form of slavery. We can see forced schooling, medical procedure, job training and placement as the enslavement of children by the state. Abortion might be seen as an exercise of absolute ownership of the baby, therefore as a vestige of slavery. The argument over when an unborn person is to be considered a person and therefore be granted the freedom of self-determination is far from settled. Ageist societies where older people have dominion over younger people, or gender preferential societies where one sex has dominion over the other, or monarchic societies where nobility confers absolute authority, are also slave societies. Dominion, in this case, has nothing to do with competence, as slaves have no right to refuse a command. Any system where the unelected rule without opposition is a slave society. The typical modern industrial society is essentially managed by thousands of unelected administrators who run localities in much the same manner as the kings of old. The state uses the threat or implementation of violence to confiscate resources and regulate the lives of its citizens, and so it is an organ of force and coercion, an ancient form of governance. It doesn't matter if those who rule do so in the name of the public interest. To the extent they make laws without the express consent of the governed, they are slave masters. In this light, we can say that even though there are manifest freedoms in some cultures, all are still partially slave societies. The pyramidal power structures that typify slave societies are nearly always overwhelmed by the exponential growth of administrative demands. The more responsibility is forcibly concentrated in the hands of a few, the more dependent people become and the more they are encouraged or forced to relinquish their freedoms to those who are responsible. Each subsequent generation will train the next, affirming and deepening compliance. As power concentrates in the state, administrators will be overwhelmed with the demands made on them. The constituency will therefore always be underserved. The more overwhelmed the administration, the more power it will arrogate to itself in order to manage the demand. The more power it takes, the more dependent, clamorous, and unmanageable the constituency, and so on. The administration will need to expand exponentially. More personnel, more equipment, more infrastructure. They might have to compromise the quality of service for expediency. Recognizing the impossibility of meeting the demand, they might bridle under the pressure and request more funds to finance the monetary, physical, and emotional costs. The work is dreary, frustrating, and time-consuming. Hopelessness fosters bitterness. They might eventually resort to outright suppression or use their social advantages in the interests of their families and friends, corrupting the declared intent of office. But if they refuse advantages to family and friends relative to their status, they weaken the ties of mutual aid that have traditionally been the expression of trust and loyalty, another and more pernicious form of social corruption. Statism is defined by protectionism, state-run enterprise, wealth redistribution programs, taxation and trusts, mergers and corporations that are hybridized with government structure. Statism is typified by government-run monopolies on money, education, medicine, scientific research and application, military, construction, housing, roads, citizenship, etc. A monopoly-dominated state-run society is slavery in its modern form. Closed markets lead to price distortion because those who offer a product or service will raise the price as high and push the quality as low as they can if they have no competition. Using purloined resources from its tax cattle, a government contracts with institutions and private sector business, allowing prices to be set without consideration for what those who are forced to finance these deals can or wish to pay. Those within government have all incentives to provoke problems, provide the supposed solutions, and in so doing justify the existence of irrelevant offices and personnel. Monopoly, the underlying structure of statism, is anti-freedom. For example, government restrictions on rental prices do not allow the cost of production to be covered. This means that many buildings will never be built, causing a housing shortage. Rent control means that the cost of upkeep will overtake income, causing landlords to reduce maintenance and renovation efforts. This is why rent-controlled housing is often substandard. Because management, upkeep, and renovation will cost more than abandoning the project, existing buildings are warehoused. In this way, the attempt to fix prices causes a given service to disappear. More often, however, that service or product will be offered at an exorbitant price for the wealthy few, ultimately deepening the divide between rich and poor. It's the monopoly on rent that causes the housing market to inflate, not the profit motive. Inflation is another form of taxation. It immobilizes the poor, consumes their savings, and sends them deeper into debt. A poor tenant, trapped by inflation, is very unlikely to move out of rent-controlled housing. Inflation immobilizes the homeless destitute for the same reasons. Recently, the Venezuelan government fixed the price of chicken. The price was too low to cover production costs, and so production stopped, a scenario that repeated itself all across the agricultural and food production sector. The military, which was privy to food stores, began a brisk black market business selling their reserves. But these reserves began to run out. The government then sent out the army to round people up and force them to work in the fields and factories, de facto slavery. Chicken used to cost around 140 bolivars. Now it's in the millions of bolivars. Runaway inflation has made the currency worthless. Private property is heavily regulated across the Western world. Time-consuming form submission, lawyer, agency, and licensing fees, landscaping codes and strictures represent the theft of individual resources and the prescription of the freedom to do what one wishes with one's own property. These regulations inflate the costs of renovation or restructuring, which, as outlined above, impounds the poor in their social class. Regulations on business have the same effect. If a business survives the investment phase, it must pass operating costs on to their customers. Inflation makes it harder to save and invest, inhibiting competition from upstart entrepreneurs. Protection is an attempt to monopolize foreign economies through price distortion. For example, rice can be sold cheaper than local prices in a foreign country when the importer's government appropriates tax money to finance the venture. The importers are above competition and their losses are covered. Protection allows them to fix the price. Once the foreign market and production infrastructure has been destroyed through underpricing, the importers often raise their prices beyond what the local market can actually bear. This can cause local government to step in and place tariffs on the imports, raising the price again. Sometimes the importer's country retaliates with sanctions, making building block essentials impossible or very expensive to get, driving inflation at home. Central banks and governments monopolize the market for money. Money is itself a market, where control causes artificial value manipulation. Manipulation will favor some and hurt others. Only a slave master would have the power to make such decisions. Mergers, trusts, or government-sponsored corporations dominate and fix prices. Through the control of price, they hold the value and credit that people create hostage. Mandatory government-run schools monopolize the market for educational curriculum, location, and approach. Hiring and firing stipulations or quotas, for whatever reason, discriminate against the market for competence and force people to associate. Mandatory wage minimums fix the market for labor, creating a barrier to young poor people entering this market, making migration that much more of a threat. Licensing or state-run regulation administrators are not elected, yet they determine what we will do with our resources, just like the ancient kings and queens. An involuntary tax system forces people to hand over the value of what they've earned without having a say in how those resources are used. Absolute freedom is a physical impossibility. However, an effort towards a free society would mean the dismantling of all but the most essential aspects of government and the allowance of a multitude of social management solutions to compete in an open market. All centralization represents a de facto return to empire, a form of colonial slavery. It doesn't matter what the ideals of the governing are. If the plan is for the few to impose a plan on the many, that is a turn towards slavery and away from freedom. Total freedom would mean complete decentralization. Each person governs themselves in the mutually guaranteed ethical constraint that each must allow the other their freedom as well, the only restriction. Let's say you offer a service at a price. If I can offer that same service at a higher quality for a lower price, you will, in your own interest, up your game to be able to compete. This will drive the price down and the quality of the service up over time, spurring scalar time and material saving innovation. Where markets are more free, constant general movement towards more efficient production methods, cheaper, better products, and service is observable even within a single lifetime. Freedom as a moral and ethical practice deters prejudice. Let's say you're squeamish about offering your service to a certain kind of person on whatever grounds. You should have the freedom to do so. Freedom of disassociation. Your freedom to refuse your service represents the ethical boundary to those who would impose their will on you. However, those who you reject are free to look elsewhere for the same service because others have the freedom to offer it, the freedom to compete. If I offer that same service to them without your inhibitions, I will have their patronage, and you will lose your marketplace bid to your own bigotry. If no one will offer that service to people on the basis of an inhibition of some kind, those people are free to offer it themselves. If no one wants the service, this is an incentive to choose to propose something that people need or are interested in, the very definition of altruism. Keynes was wrong. Consumption does not create wealth. Handing over money or granting unearned access does not make people wealthy. They will not change their social class. When people are provided with free goods and money, they are not free. They are slaves. Slaves have no incentive to create wealth. Why put in the time and effort, only to be subjected to taxes and the risks of failure and loss? There's no such thing as wealth redistribution. That's a euphemism for theft. Wealth is created by people, and free people own the value they create. Taking what they've created by force and giving it to others is claiming ownership by default, otherwise known as theft. Instantiated theft is slavery. The result, or perhaps the source of persistent structural slavery or statism, is slave morality or an enslaved mentality. Bigotry, prejudicial behavior on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, or skin color. Coveting power, equating competence and authority with the abuse of power. Resentment towards the successful, attempting to stamp out inequalities of outcome. Renouncing personal responsibility, blaming one's personal failure on past and present externalities. The belief that iniquities resulting from life choices are inherently unfair. The endorsement of and dependence on centralized power structures. Trading one's dignity for proximity to the powerful. Idolatry and fanaticism. The thought that everything should be free for the taking. Mob rule, tribalism, identitarianism result in the imposition of groupthink and herd behavior and are manifestations of slave morality or mentality. The mental slave will be content to work for others or latch on to the parasitic institutions of government through grants, contracts, universities, military, or party membership and activism, thereby becoming dependent on these extorted resources. Forced taxation. Dependence on the immoral resource of taxation creates a distorted economy, conflictual social relationships, and an inflated economy that is vulnerable to graft and corruption. Pro-freedom. Facing and re-elaborating past trauma. Taking responsibility for the future, considering one's own faults first. Produce and sell or trade whatever, wherever. Set prices and wages in negotiation. Invest in what interests us. Canonize, ridicule, insult, adulate, praise, criticize. In short, say what we wish, when and where we wish. Define ourselves as we wish. Refuse to acknowledge other people's definition of themselves. Bear arms, buy and use drugs. Forbid the use or sale of drugs in one's own space. Migrate or stay where we want to, or forbid entry into one's own space. Have sex with as many or as few people of whatever description we choose. Marry, live singly, doubly, etc., to have children or not have children, or to abort them. Anti-freedom would be mandatory taxes, regulations and permits, trusts, mergers and corporations, government deals limiting trade or international service acquisition, tax-sponsored armies, tax-sponsored initiatives to drill or mine, export or import, tax-sponsored abortion, and abortion itself could be thought to curtail the right to life and self-determination of the unborn. Tax-sponsored wall around countries, skin color and gender quotas that discriminate against people on the basis of gender and skin color, regulations on discrimination, government-led trade tariff discussions, tax-sponsored education and mandatory educational curriculum and school attendance, restriction on communications, media, journalism, and travel, prohibitions on intimate relations in school, the workplace, etc., the presumption of guilt before proof. All governments indulge their power. Those in office should be held accountable. Someone who is accountable will work to dismantle the government rather than expand it. A government that works to guarantee freedom should neither help or hinder people. Elastic markets are sensitive to price. The less something costs, the more it is consumed. The more something costs, the less it is consumed. Taxes on elastic markets stop production and consumption, removing tax revenue. Consumption will not vary much when prices change on inelastic markets. Essentials like water, staple foods, education, or certain medicines. Taxes levied on production squeeze the consumer, in this case, who's held hostage by their need for the resource. Rhetorically, taxation of the wealthy, price regulation, and subsidies are supposed to protect the consumer. However, the opposite is true for inelastic markets, the very markets where consumers are supposed to be protected. Taxes for public programs like welfare, medical, and retirement benefits or subsidies for export and investment cause price distortions on inelastic markets because producers and all their contractors do not have to concern themselves with the quality of the service or the cost to the consumer. Over time, the net result of price distortion on inelastic markets is inefficiency, lower service quality, and most of all, inflation. Inflation is a hidden tax. Inflation causes economic recession, depression. It is a pernicious hidden tax, leveraged against the poor in the name of helping the poor. Taxes above a certain rate result in decreased revenues. The more tax rates are raised, the more revenue loss there is from deterred trade. Elastic demand markets are especially sensitive to taxation. In other words, they simply disappear when taxes are levied on them. In this case, the producers are the victims, as they will be forced to pay the taxes while keeping their prices even, biting into production expenses. If they do raise their prices, their clients simply stop buying their products. They will be hard put to keep afloat, or they will be driven out of business and lose everything they have invested. Taxes force people to give up the value they make and prevent poor people from entering the market through overregulation, while ensuring their dependence on wealth redistribution. This process causes inflation, which ensures economic immobility and dependence on social programs. This is one of the reasons migrant communities do not integrate. So-called government integration programs reinforce the social bubble by removing the incentive to participate in the local culture. This is true even for born citizens. For example, my mother was a welfare recipient. When she had work, her welfare check was docked, and taxes were levied on her earnings. So she chose not to work. As a result of being helped, she never entered the job market, and so she never integrated with her own culture. Incidentally, she had no incentive to better her lot, and left her children in abject poverty and saddled us with her debts as a result. Government assistance is a ball and chain for those that are being helped and a drain on resources that would be better spent by free people making their own decisions based on immediate concerns and local conditions. Only slaves are given everything. Free people take their lives in hand and better their own lot through ingenuity, persistence, and conscientious discipline. An aspect of economic freedom is the freedom to travel and live where you choose. Wanderers usually propose their labor at a lower price, lowering the price of labor and lowering all related costs. In an effort to claim more market share, businesses then offer products and services cheaper. However, migrants who live on the welfare programs are participating in state-sponsored theft. People who take government sponsorship in order to service migrants are reinforcing state-sponsored slavery. Provided people respect the freedoms of others, competition on a free market lowers prices. Catching and punishing theft or the destruction of other people's resources and meting out justice for the betrayal of freedom should be the only function of government in a free society. Rather than participating in depravity, catching and punishing theft or the destruction of other people's resources and meting out justice for the betrayal of freedom should be the only function of government in a free society. If a country says it's free and democratic, but it has central planning and a powerful state apparatus, it is neither free nor democratic. Both capitalism and communism are often associated with a host of negative dynamics. Both are said to produce coalition monopolies, trickery, misleading advertising or propaganda, trade fraud, bribery and poverty, and imperialistic wars. But I would argue that these behavioral tendencies and outcomes have likely been a facet of human society since the first tribe formed. Other animals exhibit the same tendencies. Indeed, the natural world is full of rigid hierarchies that are often mustered through force or trickery and are generally characterized by unequal resource distribution. Certainly, for whatever reason, human beings are better off today on the whole than they were 200 years ago. Even with all our problems, there is some cause for cautious optimism. So far, societies purporting to be communist, where private property has been made illegal and the wealth of the rich was confiscated, have always devolved into authoritarianism, in stark contrast to the ideal of from each according to his desire, to each according to his need. Defenders of this social system often suggest an economic model where workers own the means of production. But what is meant by own when the so-called workers' socialist states dictate where and when and what must be produced, and at what cost and price? And who are the workers? In so-called capitalist societies, it's the person who spends years inventing and representing a service, putting in 80 to 90 odd hours a week, managing investments, creating budgets, negotiating contracts, covering payroll, opening and closing and cleaning and stocking. Is that person not a worker? They take all the risks and costs of potential success and possible failure of the value-creating context they manifested. A person who shows up after the context is created and is paid for a limited role in helping manifest that value does not have to bear these risks and costs. Are they the only worker? In any case, owning company stock is the literal manifestation of the socialist idea of worker-owned production, if only it wasn't voluntary. Therein lies the rub. This illusory ownership under social systems is mandatory. Ergo, it is an abrogation of the right to self-determination. In other words, slavery. Attempts at factory or project-wide consensus-based management fail routinely. When all have a say, many who lack the requisite competence are granted managerial status. Essential work is not done, while procedure and method are argued over. Resources, both human and material, are squandered, and deadlines are missed. If those who are competent are silenced or expelled, the endeavor will fail. If they're deferred to in crisis caused by mismanagement, they will lead by default. The worse the crisis, the heavier the hand of management. Administrative tyranny is the result of collectivism. In so-called worker states, a repressive state apparatus makes sure that no one dares to even think that they personally own something. State agents monitor all aspects of life, imprisoning and re-educating those who are politically incorrect, a system of instantiated slavery. The presence of administrators, lawmakers, presidents, ministers, and the like that form a privileged tier above the rest of the population is ultimately no different than the ancient monarchies. If they are not elected, yet have the power to force people to do things against their will or better interest, they are slave masters. In privately owned enterprises, dictatorship is often the rule, a rigid authoritarian hierarchy that resembles the oldest social systems known to us. So what's the difference? It might seem negligible, but it's an important one. As a worker in a privately owned business, I have the freedom to look for an entrepreneur who chooses to do business differently. Someone who, without abandoning leadership, seeks to reward competence and delegate responsibility fairly, and who is respectful and appreciative towards people who are assisting them in their project. If the system allows, I could even be someone like that. If my business model does well, I will attract competent workers, and other entrepreneurs might see that their modality is unnecessary or doomed. Many might change and adopt more humane standards. Does this sound familiar? Actually, this is exactly what has been happening in so-called capitalist society. However, under a system of state-dominated slavery, all business is run from the same central command, and there is no choice, no experimentation, and no opportunity to see what model works best. Democracy, republic, communist, socialist, capitalist, the marching colors and rhetoric of government do not matter. As long as it exculpates the resources of the ruled and uses those resources to impose top-down planning, the state is a form of slavery. That said, communism appears to work in small, tightly knit communities such as a single family or commune. A clear dominance hierarchy or authoritarian structure of benevolent dictatorship is a common feature of communities that share resources. All endeavor entails budgeting and the expenditure of production to include a greater return, which is partly reserved for personal use and partially reinvested. This is not a new production modality. It's simply a common sense procedure. Capitalism is, like socialism, an idea, not a system. It's the idea that the individual is sovereign, that the value of a human being is not inherent in gender, skin color, or class, but in what they do for others while seeking their own benefit. It's based on the observation that human beings follow their own interests and, when left to themselves, they will find that interest in creating and providing services and products for others. It's the idea that people own themselves, and that when they produce something, they also own and decide what to do with it. It's the notion that it is wit and ingenuity to invent or develop goods and resources and distribute them that represents wealth. A principled society that is working towards freedom for all respects the prerogative of the individual to seek their own destiny regardless of their heritage or origin, and in so doing encourages respect for others and the efficient performance of a desired service. An unprincipled society discourages respect for others, and people will lose the incentive to do their tasks well. People are most likely to do what they think will better their lot, even if that means someone else will suffer for it. This means that interactions must be regulated to punish graft, coercion, violence, and theft. If freedom is predicated on the sovereignty of the individual, then it is immoral to steal what people have earned. It doesn't matter what the purpose is. Whenever you force people to give up their earnings, even or perhaps especially for a cause, you will undoubtedly find some who do and some who do not agree with how those resources are used. Those who do not agree have had their right to self-determination abrogated, and this is the moral hypocrisy of the modern state. I'm not hostile to current social contracts, only the hypocritical promises made by those questing after political status who play on the self-interest and economic ignorance of the populace to enrich or empower themselves. I'm not advocating for the abolition of the state. I'm not advocating for total freedom. I'm merely pointing out that no state is a free society. If there is a state, it's a form of socialized slavery. The more the power of the state is centralized or concentrated, the less free the society. Free people exercise choice in the manner in which they conduct their affairs: family-oriented, collective, single-person, hierarchical business, etc. There are three basic crux problems that I think are insoluble to the effort to create a free society. Children have very few rights where self-determination is concerned. The parenting phase allows the child little or no say in where it lives, what language or cultural and moral code it must adopt. Parents, like the ancient slave masters, are socially bound to give the child everything it needs. Weak-willed parents can also lend themselves to the slavish service of their children, and children can be merciless dictators when allowed. The same slave-master relationship in reverse. The typical tyrannical child is resentful when it can't have what it wants. Slavish parents attempt to meet every whim, but when they are controlling, they often think they should manage literally everything. I see this as the microversion of the social dynamic between government and citizen. Supposedly, a citizen has a duty to its nation, but unless they are a voluntary immigrant, that person has never actually been given the choice. Do they want to live under a monarchy or a military dictatorship? Do they want to believe in Jehovah or Jack the Giant Killer? Of course, some people will not respect other people's freedoms or property, and that means we will always have to have a group of punishers with the means to punish, creating the ever-present danger that these people will begin to assert the master-slave paradigm. Freedom has attendant problems that come along with the associated agency and responsibility. For example, suffering the consequences of one's mistakes or the mistakes of others. As barriers to self-determination are removed, a free society will manifest unequal outcomes. This is fair in one sense and unfair in another. Unfair because of wealth and access disparities, fair because those who earn the bread should eat the bread. Be as that may, when a people opts for more freedom, all indexes for well-being rise. History shows that when fortified by personal ethic and allowed by circumstances, people generally want to, and actually do, make things better for each subsequent generation. The less free the society, the poorer and less mobile the populace. Ideologically driven, state-run systems often try to prevent people from any number of choices which should be left up to the individual, such as believing in the moral or political system of their choosing, or keeping, sharing, trading, or selling the bread they make, and using the credited value they receive in return as they see fit. Where people can operate in the manner that suits their characters and receive in return what they feel represents the value of the object or service they provide, they will generally put their passion, dedication, and insight to work. All others who can acquire their service will benefit. Marx insisted that once released from oppression, human beings will revert to their noble collective nature. In reality, there's every reason to believe that humans, like almost every other animal, resolve their social structures in competitive hierarchies. The belief in the necessity of an all-powerful state is proof of a deeply misanthropic distrust of people. Human beings are powerful and intelligent animals, capable of great good and great harm. We have been here all of 2 geological seconds, and we already exert so much influence that we almost have as much measurable impact on the Earth's biosphere as some insects. We have just poked our noses out of the muck and misery of poverty, serfdom, and thousands of years of slavery, and find ourselves confronted by all the issues surrounding success as a species. However, as societies grow freer, all indications for well-being rise. Correlation rather than causation? Perhaps not. Many argue that increasing freedom is the primary motive. The main thrust of the argument seems to be the liberation of individual resources through the challenge of competition and the passion that comes along with investing in something of one's own. In any case, even if it is not observed, mutually assured freedom is today's international ethical standard, an important shift in philosophy from where human social notions were 200 years ago. First, we must change our minds. Society will follow. To grant freedom to others while having it, one must be aware of the consequences of one's actions and do one's utmost to respect others while also respecting oneself and the sustaining environment. There will always be compromises and unpredictable problems to solve, and new situations that demand new adaptation skills that no one living yet has. This means there will never be perfect harmony. There will always be danger and adventure. Utopia is dystopic because one person's utopia will be another person's hell. Rebellion is the only solution for those who find a situation intolerable, which will and always has led to the use of repressive force by those in power, the imposition of what the few think is right on the many. Life and living things are by nature in process and therefore imperfect. The social orders created by living things are imperfect as a consequence. In this light, it is an inherent contradiction to insist on a particular social order or edict as if it were perfect. The closest thing to perfection we can manage is to embrace the process of becoming and strive towards mutually assured freedom.